I took the job for the silence. Heaven's Peak sat like a cragged sentinel above Glacier National Park, and from the top of the fire lookout tower, I could see the spine of the Rockies curl into the distance like the ribs of some ancient god. The wind was constant up there. It whispered through the cracked shutters and rattled the steel braces of the deck, a thin, constant reminder that solitude wasn't quite the same as peace. I arrived on a Thursday in early June. The seasonal ranger who hiked me up the last 2 miles said barely a word the entire trip. He had the kind of face that looked like it had grown from tree bark, weathered, quiet, unreadable. When we reached the tower, he handed me the keys without ceremony, adjusted his pack, and disappeared back down the trail with a single nod. Good. I didn't want company. The tower was exactly as the assignment sheet described. One room, 16 feet above the tree line, windows in every direction, a propane stove, a desk, a cot, a two-way radio, and a fire finder in the center like a ritual altar. I stood for a long time in the middle of it all, just watching the late morning sun light up the wooden floor, dust spinning in golden eddies. There was a journal from the last lookout on the desk, dated from 2 years back. Mostly dull weather notes and plant sightings. I skimmed a few pages and closed it. I wasn't here to socialize with ghosts. I was here to forget one. Guilt's a strange thing. It burns slow and cold like wet timber. The therapist the department made me see said it wasn't my fault. That wildfires were unpredictable. That terrain entrapment could happen to anyone. She used phrases like impossible visibility and fuel loading variables. I nodded along. But none of her words ever reached the part of me that watched Eric die. He was 27. Smoked clove cigarettes. Played mandolin at camp. Ran headfirst into danger because it felt right. When the winds shifted, and the fire chewed through the ridgeline like it had teeth, I called for the retreat. I made the right call. He didn't hear it. Now I had 3 months to myself in the wilderness. No visitors, no distractions. Just mountains, trees, and the radio check-in every morning at 0700. It sounded like a retreat, like penance, like a way to finally sleep through a night without dreams. But even that first night, I didn't. I lay in the cot staring at the wood ceiling, trying not to see the flames behind my eyelids. Outside, the trees sighed in the wind. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I closed my eyes and counted the slow breaths. And holed out. Somewhere between the rustling of pine needles and the creaking of the tower's frame, my mind drifted, not to rest, but to memory. The kind you can't talk over. The kind you hear even in silence. By morning, I was up before the sun. I logged the temperature and wind, did the first scan of the horizon through the firefinder. Nothing but treetops and cloudless sky. I noted a solitary deer on the ridge and wrote it down. Mule deer, adult, heading west. No smoke, no trail activity. Quiet. Quiet. That was the goal, wasn't it? But quiet doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just the absence of voices you're not ready to hear. The second day passed in the slow rhythm I remembered from my wildland days. Observation, notation, repetition. Except now there were no helicopters, no crew calls, no smoke columns to chase. Just trees. Trees and air and time. By noon, the temperature reached 61 degrees. Clear skies, low humidity, wind steady from the northwest. Ideal fire conditions, meaning there were no fires at all. My radio check-in was brief. Headquarters logged my report without question and moved on to the next tower down the range. I listened for a minute, letting the voices crackle and fade. Then silence again. The world here didn't speak unless you listened hard. Chipmunks darted beneath the underbrush. Jays squawked from the canopy. I logged their appearances by reflex, but mostly to fill the empty lines of my notebook. Something about the act of recording details kept my head clear. When everything feels the same, small changes matter more. It was during my third afternoon scan that I realized how far the sound carried from this height. Conversations from unseen hikers, the creak of old trees swaying, the distant rush of water from a stream I couldn't even see. It reminded me of something one of my old crew leads used to say, "Up high, you hear the bones of the forest shift." That night, just after 11, I heard the whistle again. Not a breeze, not the tower creaking. This was something different. A clean, single tone that rose, wavered slightly, then vanished. Like air moving through a long, narrow pipe. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then gone. I sat up in bed, holding still. Nothing. I grabbed the field notebook and made a short note. Night 2, unusual tonal sound. Short whistled. Direction unclear. Possibly wind. I waited another hour, leaning against the cool wood wall of the tower, ears open to every leaf tremble and creak. Nothing repeated. Eventually I slept. The next day I chalked it up to natural acoustics. Strange things happen in the mountains with temperature layers and shifting wind. But something about the sound had felt tuned. As if someone, or something, had meant to make it. By day 4 the animals had stopped appearing. That morning I did a full scan and saw no movement. No deer, no squirrels, not even birds. The trees were full of light and breeze, but the usual chatter of jays and thrushes was gone. Even the insects seemed muted, their hum replaced by something I couldn't quite name, a kind of hollow stillness. I tried to brush it off. Animals move on. Predators pass through and send everything underground for a while. But as I swept the horizon, unease prickled at the back of my neck. By afternoon I realized I hadn't seen Dot, the cougar I'd spotted the day I arrived, again either. It was probably nothing. Still I wrote it down. No sightings past 36 hours. Unusual quiet. No avian activity since yesterday morning. My meals became more mechanical. I stopped reading. I just sat and watched the trees expecting something. I couldn't say what. That night the whistle returned. This time it came 3 times in a row. First from the west, then seconds later from the north, then again faintly from below, deep in the woods somewhere, rising up like a distant flute note swallowed by the trees. It wasn't the same tone each time. Slightly different. Like variations of a signal. I stood by the east-facing window, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No lights. No wind. The radio was silent. I turned it on just in case. Let it hum quietly beside me. My fingers hovered over the transmit button once. I almost said something. I didn't. Eventually I went back to bed. I left the notebook open beside me. No dreams this time, but I woke with a start around 4 a.m. certain I'd heard a sound just before opening my eyes. A low rhythmic thrum, like someone humming one long quiet note deep in their chest. But there was nothing now. Just the tower creaking in the cold. I logged it anyway. Early morning, low frequency hum, not repeated. Possibly inner ear response / wind shift. Still, the words felt dishonest. I wasn't imagining it. I just didn't know what it was. On the 5th morning I realized the forest was no longer quiet. It was listening. I heard it in the way the wind moved, not randomly but in pockets, as if something large and slow was breathing through the canopy. There were no birds, no insects, not even the distant bark of a coyote. But there were sounds. New ones. I woke before dawn, convinced I'd heard something just outside the tower, like footsteps on packed soil. I listened for nearly an hour without moving. Heard nothing. But the feeling didn't fade. After sunrise I did my usual scans. Still no wildlife. No smoke. The ridgelines shimmered in the heat, and the meadows below looked untouched, too still. The trees weren't moving the way they had before. They didn't sway, they braced. By mid-morning I heard what sounded like birdsong again. A short 2-note trill, familiar and welcome. I grabbed my notebook to mark it down. But then it repeated. Same pitch. Same rhythm. Exactly. I froze. No bird I'd ever studied repeated a call like that. Birds might echo each other, sure, but this was precise. Too precise. I waited and it happened again. Same cadence. Like a recording being played over and over. I scanned the treetops. Nothing moved. The sound came again. Same notes, same spacing. 5 times. Then it stopped completely, like someone had turned off a speaker. My skin went cold. I didn't log it. Not yet. I wanted to believe it had a natural explanation. Some echo or interference or strange acoustics. But the doubt lodged itself in me like a splinter. That night the whistling came back, but now it had company. The tone returned at 10:43 p.m., just as I was finishing a weather entry. It came from the west again, but now it wasn't alone. Beneath the whistle was a low hum, like the one I'd half-dreamed a few nights before. Only this time it was unmistakably real. It wasn't a constant tone. It pulsed. Slow and deep, like a mechanical drone or a distant chant. It came in waves, low enough to feel in my chest. Then silence. I walked from window to window. Nothing out there. The trees moved gently in the breeze, but the sound didn't return. I sat down by the radio, turned the volume up slightly, and listened to static for nearly 30 minutes. Eventually I tried to sleep. I left the windows open that night, just a crack, enough to hear. And at some point, maybe around 3, I heard the birds again. Only they weren't birds. Same 2-note trill, repeated every 30 seconds. No variation. No movement. Just that sound, again and again, too regular to be natural. Then I heard it, barely above a whisper, layered in the background. My name. Not spoken. Breathe. Eli. The wind picked up right after. The tower groaned. I turned on the overhead light and sat there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I'd been asleep, that I was dreaming. I wasn't. At dawn, I checked the base of the tower from the deck. Nothing disturbed. No tracks. No signs of wildlife. The ground looked untouched. I logged the sounds anyway. 0400 HRS. Repeating mimicry, possible avian calls but unnatural repetition. Two-tone trill X7. Possible auditory illusion. Secondary event. Rhythmic hum, 8 to 12 Hz EST, likely wind through canopy. Unverified anomaly, name heard faintly. No source confirmed. I kept the wording clinical. Detached. But as I wrote it, I couldn't stop glancing at the trees, how they stood like silent witnesses, too still in the morning light. By noon the wind changed. The air felt dense, like breathing through cloth. I tried scanning again but gave up halfway through. My thoughts wandered. My focus frayed. I sat on the deck with coffee gone cold, watching the tree line. Hoping for a deer. A crow. A squirrel. Anything real. None came. That night I left the radio on. The storm rolled in just after noon, wind, brief spats of rain, and the kind of heavy cloud cover that turns everything gray and close. I sat on the floor of the tower with my back to the wall, organizing the storage chest beneath the kitchen shelf more out of boredom than necessity. That's when I found the journal. It was wedged behind an old Coleman fuel canister, warped and partially charred along the edges. The cover was brittle with heat damage, its original color long lost to smoke and time. When I pulled it free, ash dusted my shirt. I sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it carefully. The pages were water-stained, ink blurred in places. But enough remained to read. There was no name on the cover or inside, no date, only a clipped entry style, short bursts, notations, scrawled thoughts like someone writing for survival, not reflection. June 17th, the call came again, this time closer. Don't respond. That's what they told me. Never respond. June 20th, whistling at 2:12 a.m., different this time. Higher. Harmonic layering? Felt it in my teeth. June 24th, trees don't sway when it speaks. Whole ridge line froze. Bird calls echoed me. Not birds. I turned the pages slowly, every word a drop of cold water down my spine. The author's tone shifted as the entries went on, shorter sentences, more repetition. Certain words were underlined over and over. It walks. It walks. It walks. Do not answer. Not with voice. Not even in your head. There were pages burned through completely, entries half destroyed by what looked like scorch marks from the inside out. Protocol echo initiated? No confirmation. Tower 6 unresponsive. Marla may be compromised. That name. Marla. I reread the line 3 times. There was no other mention of her. But the sentence stuck out like a splinter under skin. Sound mimics breath patterns. Test your voice. Voice that walks. Voice that walks. Voice. The last full page was mostly ink smears and singed paper. The final legible words were scrawled along the bottom corner, barely hanging on to the charred edge. Don't listen after dark. I closed the journal carefully. My hands were shaking. I sat there for a long time on the floor, watching the rain hit the glass in slanted lines, the sound of it whispering across the metal roof. I told myself it was just an old lookout's ramblings. Too much time alone. Isolation wears people thin. But it mirrored too much of what I'd already been hearing. I made coffee and reread the journal twice that afternoon. Certain phrases wouldn't leave me. Voice that walks, test your voice, do not answer. The phrasing felt deliberate, ritualistic. And that last bit, Marla. Was that a person? Another lookout? Someone from before? I checked the reference maps and radio logs in the binder under the desk. There was no listing for a Tower 6. Heaven's Peak was listed as Station 4. Nothing north, east, or west currently manned. The only recent entry was my own. At 7 p.m. the rain stopped. The air went still in a way that felt unnatural, like the world had been paused mid-motion. I stood on the deck with the journal in one hand, staring out at the soaked forest. The sky was cloud-thick but no longer moving. Not a bird. Not a breeze. Just waiting. The sun slipped behind the mountains. The light died fast after that. I went inside and turned on the lanterns. I couldn't bring myself to play music or turn on the radio. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. Around 10 p.m. I started hearing the trills again. Same 2-note pattern. Same spacing. But now, it was closer. At 10:43 the whistling began, 4 tones in descending order. A lull. Then 3 more. Shorter. Higher. I counted 35 repetitions before it stopped. No wind. No echoes. I didn't write it down. Instead, I opened the charred journal again and set it beside my own notebook. I traced the words with my finger. Don't listen after dark. I stayed awake until dawn with the lights on and the windows closed. Something out there wanted me to listen. Something was learning how to speak. I didn't sleep the night after reading the journal. I watched the forest through the glass, waiting for something to move, to shift, to speak. But it didn't. And somehow that was worse. The next day, I monitored every frequency I had access to. Standard Ranger comms. Fire channels. Even the old analog bands that hadn't been used in years. Nothing came through. Just the low comfort of static. The journal's mention of Marla haunted me, and I kept replaying that line in my head. Marla may be compromised. I scanned the sky with binoculars. The ridges were clear. Nothing in the meadows. No signs of hikers. Not even a distant eagle. The silence was no longer absence. It had shape and intent. That evening, just after 9 p.m., I was scribbling down a log entry when the radio crackled to life. At first, it sounded like a burst of feedback, just a clipped fragment of static. But then a voice broke through. Not loud. Not clear. But undeniably there. Heavens? Peak, hear me? I froze. The transmission repeated. Warped. Slurred slightly like a bad tape. There, this is Marla. I stared at the handset. The voice sounded almost normal. Almost. But there was something off in the cadence. The words came with odd spacing. Certain consonants caught like they were being pulled through broken teeth. I picked up the mic. Marla? This is Heaven's Peak. I read you. Please confirm. The transmission cut across me. Don't respond, not if it's dark. A beat of static. Protocol echo, initiated, forest is active. A high-pitched squeal followed, sharp enough to make me wince and jerk the radio away from my ear. The channel fell dead. I checked the time, 9:17 p.m. I sat for several minutes, not moving, not breathing. Protocol echo. The phrase was in the journal. I hadn't imagined it. And now someone, something, on the same frequency was telling me it had been initiated. But no one had mentioned it in my onboarding. No ranger briefings. No paperwork. Nothing in the logs or emergency binders. It was like a ghost protocol, real enough to be named but never meant to be known. I tried to hail her again. Marla, this is Eli Mercer at Heaven's Peak. Can you repeat your last transmission? Silence. Then. Listen when you speak, stay above ground, don't follow sounds. The voice cut out again. Not with a pop or a fade, but like someone had ripped the signal apart mid-sentence. I stared at the handset. My mouth was dry. I looked out the windows. The forest below was painted in moonlight, but everything felt flattened, dim. As if the world outside the tower had been paused and copied. A photo hung in place of the real thing. At 10:03 p.m., the birdsong started again. Same two-note trill. Identical spacing. This time it was accompanied by something new. A third note, almost a harmony, lower and off-key, like a voice trying to imitate the call. It repeated twice. Then silence. The air around the tower thickened. The floor felt like it hummed beneath my boots. A tension I couldn't explain crept into my arms, my spine. It felt like standing too close to power lines, like my bones were reacting to something my mind couldn't process. I didn't leave the tower. I didn't speak again. I sat with the burned journal open in my lap and my notebook beside it, the word Marla underlined 3 times. I turned the radio off. At 2:18 a.m., something scratched once at the metal support beam under the floor. Then the forest went still again, like it was waiting for me to answer. The forest changed on the 7th day. Not all at once. Not in a way I could pinpoint. But something vital had drained out of it. The colors looked the same, the pine needles, the granite, the blue smear of sky overhead, but the ecosystem was wrong. No squirrels. No insects. No birds. The morning air was heavy with quiet, the kind that settles over a place after a storm or before a death. I stood at the firefinder and scanned the ridgelines, but there was no motion. Not in the trees, not in the underbrush. Even the grass in the lower meadows had gone still. I flipped through my logbook and realized I hadn't recorded an animal sighting in nearly 4 days. Not even droppings. Not even tracks. It felt like the world below had been erased. My breathing echoed in the room like I was inside a cathedral. The sound of my boots against the floor startled me more than once. I walked the perimeter of the tower twice, pausing at each window, staring down at the identical stillness in every direction. It was like being the last living thing in a museum diorama. By noon, the silence had become unbearable. I turned the radio back on, half hoping Marla's voice would return, even broken, even wrong. But the only sound was a flat wash of static. I flipped through channels slowly, listening for anything. Birds, people, planes, anything. Nothing. Then, just as I passed through an old Firewatch frequency, channel 19, a click. Not a word. Just a click. Like someone pressing the mic button and releasing it. I froze. I leaned in and said, "Heavens Peak Station. Please identify." Silence. Then click. I scanned the dial again. Static. Yes. Then another click, shorter, closer. I turned the volume down and sat very still. It didn't happen again. I noted the time, 12:47 p.m., and tried to brush it off. Old equipment. Signal bleed. Radio echo. But something inside me had shifted. A gut certainty that I wasn't alone. That's when I decided to check the base of the tower. I'd stayed up high since the humming began. I told myself it was safer. More visibility. Less chance of surprises. But now I needed to see it for myself, prove that nothing was down there. That I wasn't being watched. I geared up slowly, boots, gloves, jacket. The wind was picking up, dry and fast, the kind that sets treetops rustling without touching the ground. I descended the metal steps one at a time, scanning the perimeter. No movement. No sound. The soil around the tower was untouched. No tracks. No disturbed brush. I did a full 360, checking behind every boulder and tree within a 30-foot radius. Then I saw it. Half buried under a rock shelf just beyond the north treeline, a small metal box. It was dark gray, the kind used for weatherproofing trail cams. But this one wasn't pointed at a game trail or animal path. It was aimed directly at the tower. I moved slowly, crouched beside it, and brushed away the dirt. It was bolted into a rock face, disguised with lichen and moss, but the lens was unmistakable, infrared, long range. An old government issue by the look of it. There was no identifying number. No battery pack. No live feed cable. Just a box. Watching. I pried it loose and carried it back up to the tower. Inside, I laid it on the desk and studied it. The casing was scratched and worn like it had been exposed for years. I unscrewed the back panel and found a dead lithium cell and a ruined memory chip, burned through in one corner like it had shorted out from the inside. But before it failed, it had been recording. I checked the storage slot again, and just beneath the charred chip was a thin piece of microfilm, tucked between the circuit board and the case lining. I held it up to the light. There were stills, grainy, black and white, probably converted from video frames. The images were sequential, printed in strips. All taken from the same angle. All showing the tower. Most were empty. Just trees and stairs and silence. But then a figure. Someone on the deck. It was me. Standing outside the tower looking into the trees. Frame after frame. Sometimes pacing. Sometimes staring. Once, in one image, I was crouched, mouth open as if speaking, to something just out of frame. There was no date stamp. No time code. But I didn't remember any of it. I flipped to the last strip. The final image showed me halfway down the steps, arms limp at my sides, head tilted back. My mouth was open. The caption, scratched by hand along the border, read, "Echo in motion. Subject response observed." I dropped the film on the desk and stepped back like it had burned me. My pulse was racing. My throat felt tight. I turned the camera casing over in my hands, trying to find any clue, any number, any marking. Nothing. Who had put this here? And if they were watching, why? That night I didn't sleep. I left every light on, every curtain drawn. I sat by the window with the radio in my lap and the burned journal on the desk. I didn't turn the radio on. I just listened. The forest didn't whistle that night. Didn't hum. Didn't mimic. Just waited. Like it knew what I'd found. The radio call came at 3:42 p.m. A short burst of static, then a clipped voice from dispatch. "Heavens Peak, be advised. Unconfirmed hiker distress report, possible last known location within 3 miles west of your tower. No ranger availability for ground response. Please maintain observation and report any sightings." I acknowledged, trying to keep my voice steady. They gave me coordinates, a rough grid just below Ridgeway Cutoff. A shallow basin with game trails and dense pine. It wasn't far. Maybe a 90-minute hike if the terrain held. I checked the map, marked the spot, and stared at it for a long time. "Don't leave the tower after dark." Marla's voice echoed in the back of my skull, warped and broken, but still sharp enough to hurt. I'd followed that rule for a week. Sat through nights of whistling, mimicry, and silence thick enough to smother my thoughts. I had obeyed. But this was different. This was someone out there. Someone who might still be alive. I waited until 4:15. Then I packed. Headlamp, radio, water, field knife, emergency flare. I layered on a second jacket and tied orange flagging to the back of my pack. I left a note in the logbook just in case. Gone to check possible lost hiker. 4:17 p.m. coordinates attached. I told myself I'd be back before dark. I reached the tree line in 20 minutes. The forest closed around me like a closing mouth. I took the western trail, moving fast but alert. The deeper I went, the more wrong the woods felt. Not just quiet, muted, like walking underwater. I passed 2 dead raccoons along the trail. No signs of injury. No scavenging. Just curled up beneath pine trees like they'd fallen asleep mid-step. At 5:32, I found the first sign. A boot print. Faint but human. Tread matched standard hiking gear. Nearby, a torn piece of nylon fluttered in a low branch, blue, sun-faded. Then I saw smoke. Not fire. Just the faint trace of ash drifting from a cluster of trees ahead. I stepped through the underbrush and into a clearing, and froze. The campsite had been destroyed. A tent, collapsed, torn open from the side. The poles bent in opposite directions. Sleeping bag shredded and half buried under dirt. Scattered gear stomped flat into the moss. Something bad had happened here. I circled slowly, noting everything. The fire pit was cold, ringed with blackened stones. Nearby, a cooking pot sat dented beside a snapped canteen. Then I saw the tree. It stood just at the clearing's edge. A white pine. Tall, intact, except for the thing wedged into its bark. A human jawbone. Pressed into the trunk at shoulder height. Teeth intact. Blood long dried. The bark around it was split, not by natural force but something deliberate. Like the tree had grown around it. My hands started shaking. I reached for the radio. Dispatch, this is Heaven's Peak. I've located the hiker's site. It's not intact. No visible subject. Evidence of struggle. Possible fatality. Request immediate. The radio hissed. Then clicked. No response. Dispatch, do you read me? Another click. Then silence. I backed away from the tree. The hairs on my arms stood straight. Something was moving out there. Not footsteps. Not voices. Just pressure, like the air was changing shape. I turned to head back and then I saw the rocks. Clustered along the north side of the clearing was a scatter of limestone fragments. At first I thought it was just runoff debris. But then I looked closer. Scratches. Dozens of them. Etched into the flat faces. Some were crude marks. Others looked like names. But one near the center was unmistakable. Eli Mercer. The letters were jagged, uneven, carved deep. Beneath the name was a date. July 13, 2013. 12 years ago. I dropped to my knees and touched the stone. The scratches were real. Weathered but unmistakably human-made. 12 years ago I would have been 21. A rookie on my first fire crew. I'd never been to Glacier. Never even heard of Heaven's Peak. But the stone said otherwise. A sudden gust shook the treetops, and a strange sound filtered down through the canopy, like distant voices layered into the wind, whispering just out of reach. My head ached. I stumbled back from the rocks and checked my compass. The needle spun twice before settling, but it was wrong. North pointed toward the ridge, not the valley. I turned around. The trees looked different now. Closer. Wrong. I ran. No trail. No markers. Just instinct. My legs moved through underbrush and shallow creeks, dodging roots and limbs, until I saw the tower's silhouette against the darkening sky. I reached the steps gasping for air. Once inside, I bolted the door, dropped to the floor, and sat against the wall with the jawbone still burned into my vision. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the date carved into the rock. About the camera. About what the forest was trying to show me, or make me forget. The woods remembered me. Even if I didn't remember them. The name on the stone wouldn't leave me. I stared at it again in the morning light, sitting alone at the desk, hands clasped like I was waiting for judgment. I must have written my name 100 times that day, on paper, on the fogged window, into the dust of the floorboards, watching for some difference, some deviation, like the forest might have gotten it wrong. It hadn't. Eli Mercer. July 13, 2013. The name was mine. The date wasn't. I wasn't here then. I couldn't have been. I tore through the old logs stored in the chest. Years of past lookouts, weather entries, wildlife tallies, radio contact sheets. I checked every name against every year. No mention of an Eli Mercer. Not in 2013. Not before. Not after. I started reading my own logs again, slowly this time looking for inconsistencies. Misspellings. Altered entries. But the writing was mine. The pen strokes familiar. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had added things when I wasn't looking. Whispered events into the margins when I wasn't watching. The forest outside felt too still. Too practiced. At noon I went back to the metal box. The surveillance unit. I hadn't touched it since I found it. There were no new photos. The burned chip still useless. But the idea of it, the fact that it had been aimed at my tower for who knows how long, lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. Someone at some point had needed to watch this place. And they hadn't stopped when the last lookout left. Why me? I started to wonder if I'd really taken this job, or if it had taken me. That night the static began again. The radio clicked on by itself, its power knob still in the off position. Eli. Marla's voice was wrong now. Crooked. Less static, more stutter. As if it wasn't a voice being transmitted but a voice being built. Don't speak after dark, it's listening for cadence now, not just words. Her voice shivered into distortion. You're not all you anymore. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe. I turned the mic over in my hands, heart pounding, trying to remember exactly how long it had been since I said my name out loud. Was that how it worked? Voice prints? Cadence? Was it copying me? I looked at the reflection in the dark glass of the window. My face stared back. Familiar. Still. But something behind the eyes felt borrowed. Later that night I saw a light in the trees. Faint. Flickering. Not fire. Not electric. A pulse, low to the ground, moving slowly along the ridge to the west. I stood motionless, lights off, tracking it for 20 minutes. It never approached the tower. It didn't signal. It just moved, steady and patient, like it knew I was watching. At 2:14 a.m. I wrote in the journal, beginning to suspect a form of mimicry rooted in sound recognition. Patterns equals voice cadence, breath timing. Not just imitation, reconstruction. Identity drift. Still myself, I think, but feeling thinner. Like parts of memory are fraying. I stopped after that. Closed the book. Laid awake until dawn. The forest didn't speak. But it didn't need to. It had already said my name. It started with the static again. Just after 3 a.m., while I was pretending to sleep, the radio clicked on by itself. Not a voice this time. Not even a fake one. Just static that pulsed at uneven intervals, like breathing. I didn't respond. I didn't move. It played for 17 minutes. When it stopped, I sat up and made my decision. If I was losing my mind, I needed proof. If I wasn't, I needed to know who or what had been watching me. I pulled out the metal box from beneath the cot. The old surveillance unit. I hadn't touched it in 2 days, but something about it had changed. The casing felt warmer. The film canister loose in its slot. I opened the compartment again. Inside, beneath the scorched chip and old microfilm, was something new. A memory card. I didn't own a device up here that could read it. But I remembered the emergency laptop stored in the bottom cabinet, locked up for documentation purposes. I broke the seal, booted it, and slid the card in. There were only 2 files. The first was video. No metadata. No timestamps. The second was a text document labeled Protocol be initiated.txt. I opened the video first. The footage was grainy, night vision green. It showed the fire lookout tower from a wide-angle lens, possibly from the same position where I'd found the camera, but now slightly elevated. Frame by frame, I saw myself moving in and out of the tower day and night. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just my routines, meals, scans, notes. But then I saw myself descend the stairs at night. What? Then again. Then again. In the footage, I never used a flashlight. Never looked around. Just walked into the trees with a slack expression, as though pulled by a thread. One clip showed me standing in the clearing below the tower, arms limp, head tilted. My lips moved. No sound. Another showed me whispering into the empty forest. The whispering didn't match anything I remembered. My mouth formed words I couldn't identify. Sibilant, rhythmic, looping. Like a chant. But worse was the sound. Barely audible on the recording, but there, another voice layered beneath mine, almost in harmony. Not speaking. Breathing. Inhale for inhale. Exhale for exhale. I scrubbed through hours of footage. My body repeated motions. Leaning against the railing in exactly the same way, looking west at sunset without blinking, even brushing my hair back with the same hand at the same time on different nights. As if I wasn't reacting to the world but replaying a script. And the worst part. In one segment, dated by system clock to July 13, 2013, I saw a man step onto the deck. He looked like me. Older. Weathered. Same posture. Same gait. He stood at the railing, turned slowly to face the camera, and smiled. Then the screen went black. My stomach dropped. I opened the second file. Protocol Echo, dormant phase compromised. Initiation parameters breached. Speech cadence and identity overlay exceeding tolerance thresholds. Do not transmit name. Avoid mirrored terrain and reflective surfaces. Night egress prohibited post-auditory trigger, post-hum interval. Psychological absorption in progress. Potential full echo state at 72 hours post-incident. Monitor subject. Mercer under 83. Status, unstable. Action required, contain or evacuate. I slammed the laptop shut. My pulse was thudding so loud it hurt. They knew. Someone had known. This wasn't about fire watching. I had been placed here, studied, measured, not to stop fires, but to test a pattern, a presence. Protocol Echo wasn't a myth. It was a containment procedure. And I was the test. I tried the radio. Again and again. Different bands. Emergency signals. Static. Then, finally, something. A single tone. Oh, warbled. Not natural. It repeated once. Then again. 3 long pulses rising in pitch. Then silence. The same pattern I'd heard in the whistling. A signal. A call. It was inside now. Not the entity. The rhythm. I could feel it in my bones. A cadence not my own. I began mouthing words without meaning to. Silent syllables. Rhythmic pulses. My voice but not mine. I pressed my hand against the glass and stared into the forest. Below, the trees shifted. Not wind. Not shadow. Form. Movement. No figures. Just a sense, like something ancient rearranging itself. I backed away from the window and collapsed into the chair, the laptop blinking at me from the desk. The card still inside. My name was no longer safe. I wrote only this in my notebook before the pen slipped from my fingers. It wears the words first. I didn't leave the tower until midday. I waited until the sun was high, the shadows short, the wind dry. I packed light, just enough water, the flare, the journal, and the map. I circled the coordinates from the surveillance footage, triangulated with the hiker's last known position, and began toward the ridge west of the tower. The forest had changed. Not in appearance. The trees still stood, the trail still led downward, but the atmosphere felt hollowed. Like a cathedral built from silence. I moved carefully, listening. Nothing moved, not even the air. Near the old drainage ravine I found it. A narrow metal hatch, covered by a thick tangle of pine needles and moss. The edges had been bolted shut once, but the bolts were rusted and broken. The steel door bore no insignia, just a serial number and a warning label faded to illegibility. It shouldn't have been there. Not on any park map. I pried it open. The ladder inside led straight down into darkness. I counted 31 rungs before my boots touched concrete. The air was cold, stale. Beneath the earth, time had slowed to a crawl. The corridor was narrow and reinforced. Old signage in Cyrillic script and military English adorned the walls. One phrase repeated in stenciled red paint. Echo control, maintain silence. I walked deeper. The hallway ended at a steel door, warped but open. Inside was a room built from nightmare logic, a blend of Cold War tech and occult geometry. Maps of the park on the wall, overlaid with concentric rings and numbers. Audio reels marked with frequencies. And in the center, an observation chair wired with electrodes. The room looked abandoned for decades. Dust layered every surface. But the equipment was intact. I approached a cabinet labeled Protocol Echo Phase 2. Inside were stacks of yellowed folders and a reel-to-reel recorder. I powered it on. It groaned to life, then clicked. The recording crackled. Test subject Mercer. 1 exhibited consistent speech overlap after exposure to echo sequence delta. Memory layering initiated on day 6. By day 8, speech cadence was fully absorbed. I froze. Protocol Echo was not designed for communication. It was designed for quarantine. Subject retention below 10%. The forest is no longer dormant. Repeat, containment breach confirmed. Another voice, more distorted, cut in. Identity transmission is faster through grief-anchored minds. The mimicry begins in the breath. Then voice. Then thought. I turned off the machine. In the corner of the room was a mural, half-painted, left to rot. It showed a figure of smoke and mouths walking through the trees, with silhouettes of men behind it. Each silhouette bore the same face. My face. I read the documents until my hands went numb. They detailed experiments from 1962 through 1981, acoustic resonance studies, involving long-term isolation in wilderness towers. The goal wasn't fire prevention. It was observation. Test the echo's reach. Measure its ability to copy, to adapt. They brought subjects here. Then they stopped reporting. The entity, the echo, was not bound by shape or time. It nested in voices, waited inside remembered names. It did not kill. It wore. It learned. It left you alive long enough to hear yourself answer back in someone else's cadence. The final entry was written by someone named Dr. Ezra Lovick. It was a warning but also a resignation. Echo absorption is inevitable once naming has occurred. Memory no longer belongs to the host. We do not remember ourselves. We remember what it lets us. I dropped the folder. A mirror leaned against the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before. I stepped closer against my better judgment. The reflection didn't mimic me. It stood with my face, my eyes, my clothes, but the movements were half a second behind. And when my mouth stayed shut, the reflection whispered. My legs moved before I told them to. I ran. Climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time, lungs burning, sunlight crashing into me like a hammer. I slammed the hatch and bolted it even though I knew it wouldn't hold. Back at the tower, I found my logbook open. A new entry had been written in my handwriting. Asterisk Day 1 Arrival. Weather clear. No sightings. Will advise. Day 2 Whistling. Day 3 Voice heard in static. Day 4 Becoming fluent. Day 5 Becoming fluent. Day 6 Becoming fluent. Day 7 Becoming fluent. Day 8 Becoming fluent. Day 9 I am here now. Day 10 I am you. Asterisk. The fire watch didn't matter. The echo wasn't here to be contained. It was waiting to be heard. The first plume of smoke rose just past dawn. A long, lazy column trailing from the southwest, too distant to threaten immediately but steady, thick, and rising. I watched it through binoculars. The source was below Dead Horse Pass. A lightning strike maybe. Maybe something else. Either way it was moving fast. Dispatch wasn't responding. I tried again. Channel 6. Channel 19. Even the NOAA emergency bands. Nothing but a low hum like the sound a refrigerator makes just before it dies. The tower's emergency beacon still worked. A flickering red light on the console. It flashed once every 10 seconds, dutiful and ignored. The forest below me had stopped pretending. Bird calls had become rhythmic ticks. No melodies. No chaos. Just patterns. Breaths spaced like metronomes. The silence between them pulsed like an open mouth. I found myself mimicking the pattern without realizing it. Inhale, 2, 3, exhale, 2, 3. By noon, the sky had browned. Smoke drifted over the treetops in sheets, stinging the air. The sun was a smudged coin behind the haze. That's when the voices started again. Not the radio. Not the wind. Voices in the trees. They didn't shout or cry. They called. Eli. My name in my father's voice. Then my mother's. Then Corey's, my teammate who died last spring in the Sawtooth burn. Still in there? Come back. I gripped the railing until my knuckles went pale. My vision doubled. The deck swayed under my boots like the tower had grown taller in the night. I turned away from the trees. Back inside. There was gear in the cabinet. Emergency flame retardant clothing, respirator mask, fire shelters. I hadn't remembered seeing them before, but the tags were marked for my station. My name was printed on the helmet. I didn't remember packing it. The smoke thickened by 3 p.m. A hot wind swept the ridge. I watched embers drift down the sky like dead insects. I checked the maps again. Wind direction would push the fire here by morning. I had a choice to make. Flee now, down the west ridge, across the firebreak and toward the old Ranger Road. But I'd seen what lived out there. Heard it. Or stay, try to hold the line. Use the gear. Dig trenches. Burn off the brush. Fight. But fight what? The echo wasn't afraid of fire. It was the fire. It was everything we couldn't hold, couldn't contain. Grief, memory, mimicry. It came through pain and repeated itself until it was true. Until you believed it had always been there. I sat on the floor with the burned journal in my lap and the flare in my hand. I could smell the resin from the trees burning 2 ridges away. I could hear my own voice echoing back through the tower's hollow interior. Except it wasn't echoing. It was answering. Come down, Eli. You've already left. Let me carry you. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. The flare felt heavier than it should. Like it wasn't a tool anymore but a fuse. I stood and opened the last cabinet, one I hadn't noticed before. Behind the stacked manuals was a plastic-wrapped folder. Inside, an evacuation plan, handwritten, with only one line. If Protocol Echo exceeds containment threshold, do not run. Burn everything. You included. There was a final page beneath it. Photocopied. A face. My face. But the name read, Mayor/031E. Status expired. Disposition, contained via burn line initiation. I dropped the folder. Outside, the forest began to scream. Not with voices. With memory. I heard Corey yelling orders. I heard dispatch on my first day. I heard myself laughing at age 13. I heard my mother humming lullabies long after she died. They rose in a chorus and layered until none of them were mine anymore. I grabbed the flare. I stepped onto the deck. The forest opened its lungs. And waited. The fire crested the southern ridge by dusk. I watched it from the tower roof. The sky turned to bruise and blood, the trees below igniting one by one like old film catching flame. The air stank of resin and memory. I'd spread accelerant around the tower's base, old fuel drums, cleaning alcohol, even lantern oil. I didn't remember carrying it all, but it was there. Waiting. Just like me. The flare rested in my hand like a question. In my other hand was the radio mic. I hadn't spoken into it since the forest called my name in my father's voice. I didn't trust what would come out. If it would still sound like me. But someone had to say it. Something had to be left behind. I pressed the transmit button. This is Heaven's Peak Fire Lookout. Eli Mercer transmitting. July 13th. Fire is active on the South Ridge. Visibility poor. No evacuation route viable. I waited. Static. I spoke again. There's something in this forest. Something old. It doesn't burn. It doesn't die. It remembers. The radio crackled. Eli. I flinched. Not because of the voice, but because it sounded like mine. A perfect match. Cadence. Breath. I clicked the mic. If anyone hears this, don't speak your name out loud. Don't listen to voices after dark. Don't trust the forest when it's quiet. Silence. Then. You made it home. The voice was my mother's. Then, we're proud of you. Corey. Come down, Eli. All of them. All at once. Layered. Harmonized. I dropped the mic. The wind shifted. The flames twisted left, circling toward the base of the tower. I stepped back inside. Every surface of the lookout had been touched by me, and now none of it felt familiar. The books, the chair, the cot. Even the mirror. Especially the mirror. My reflection didn't look back anymore. It watched. It waited. It smiled. I lit the flare. Held it to the corner of the curtain. The fabric caught slowly, then fast. Within seconds, fire kissed the ceiling. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I sat by the open window and watched the forest begin to shift, not in fear but in reception. It welcomed the flame like an old hymn returned. The last thing I did was press record on the tower's black box. I leaned close, spoke slow. My name was Eli Mercer. I think. If you hear this, don't answer the calls at night. Don't trust the birds. Don't bring mirrors. Don't say your name more than once. The heat warped the walls. The journal curled into ash. If you forget everything else, I whispered, remember this. If something answers in your voice, it's already inside. I paused and smiled, then said calmly, I am fluent now. Postscript. The tower's remains were found 7 days later by an aerial crew. The fire burned fast and hot, but oddly localized, like it had circled the tower without consuming the trees beyond. No body was recovered. No transmission logs survived. But in the ranger station, 2 weeks later, an unattended radio on Channel 6 broadcast one message on repeat. Heaven's Peak Fire Lookout, weather clear, no sightings will advise. The voice was calm, unmistakably human. But no one ever confirmed who it belonged to.